Welcome to episode 130 of the XS Noize Podcast. I'm Mark Millar. Thanks for listening. In this episode, I speak to Jon McClure from Reverend And The Makers to discuss his new album, Heatwave in the Cold North. If you missed the previous episode, I spoke to Clem Burke and Finn from the Tearaways. So check it out, and if you like the podcast, please subscribe on your favourite listening platform, give us a rating, and leave a comment. Before we begin, here's Daniel Lynch with what's been happening on XS Noize this week.
In the reviews section, Laurie Gava gives a near-perfect score to the new album from Sufjan Stevens, Timo Andres and Conor Hannock. Reflections is the instrumental soundtrack to a ballet of the same name. Laurie says it's an engaging addition to Stevens' discography and shows his ability to produce worthy music regardless of genre. Welcome to Okuma Rising is the second album of Woody Guthrie lyrics the Dropkick Murphys have put to their trademark Celtic punk sound. Ian Byrne says the album shows Guthrie and Dropkick Murphys as comfortable bedfellows with great synergy, 5 stars. Finally, Niall Donnelly has been listening to Age of Apathy solo sessions from Grammy nominee Aoife O'Donovan. It's an 8-track acoustic version of her third album, and the stripped-back sounds allows listeners to rediscover and redefine her music. Read the reviews and stay up to date with new releases and tour news at xsnoize.com.
Reverend And The Makers have released Heatwave in the Cold North, their biggest, best and most accessible and ambitious songs to date. In this interview, Jon McClure talks about writing and recording the album, travelling to Africa, working with a camel, live shows and lots more. So sit back, relax and enjoy the XS Noize Podcast with Jon McClure from Reverend And The Makers. So hi Jon, welcome to the XS Noize Podcast.
Thank you.
Going back to the start, can you remember the first band or artist that made you pay attention to music?
Yeah, like as a really little kid, I remember my parents playing like Barry White and then like UB40 maybe, Billy Joel. I remember my mum and dad playing. But my parents listened to stuff like a lot of Philadelphia Soul, so like the OGs, Delphonics. My dad likes Billy Paul, so like some of that music, which weirdly has made its way into this album, which is a bit of a weird sort of completion of a circle. My dad once told me when he were really hammered that I were conceived to Barry White. So I wonder if like some of that's in my DNA or something, you know.
Brilliant. Has music always been the career path that you wanted to follow, or when you were growing up, did you have other ambitions?
I guess as a relatively young kid going into secondary school, primary school, I was without being arrogant, I guess I was intelligent but a bit naughty. And so we're never really sure. I remember telling my parents when I was a kid I wanted to paint yellow lines on roads. That was my ideal job. And then I was always sort of into music but never really in bands. And I went to uni. And I did a series of like awful jobs like call centre, department store, steel factory, scaffolding, worked in a pub. But then I went to uni and I studied history. And I kind of had it in my head that I might become a teacher. And so I did a PGCE and I lasted about a month and just were like terrible at it. They sent me to this school and I was like, what am I doing here? I'm not supposed to do this. So yeah, I guess like by that point, 18, 19, I'm starting to really get into being in bands and sort of that distracted me very much from education really. And I can distinctly remember my mum saying, you'll never make out of this music, you need to get a proper job. And here I am, 7 albums in, 8 albums if you include side projects, you know, in a relatively, you know, fortuitous position financially and whatever. And I think, oh, well, I was lucky in lots of ways, but also I've sort of worked hard. And I do sometimes remind her, I say, Mother, you know, I've done all right, don't you? And she's like, oh, whatever. You know, so it's nice to sort of prove her wrong in a nice way. I love my mum, you know what I mean? I don't mean it in a naggy way. I love her a bit. So, but it's nice to prove her wrong, definitely.
Julie wants what's best for you.
She's a good lass. I mean, weirdly, my mum was a club turd. She was a singer. She was in a band called the Scorpions. Not them Scorpions, like the Sheffield club turn variety. So it's definitely sort of a family thing, music. My dad's a big, massive music fan. I had loads of records growing up and that. So it's certainly like a thing that I guess is in the family, you know.
Well, you says you were doing sort of, all those jobs over the years, growing up. But were you hearing songs and melodies in your head?
Yeah, a little bit. I guess so. I mean, my mum's one of 7 kids, and they've all got like 1 million kids. So there's like 50, 60, 70 eras. And a lot of that family lived in an area called Upperthorpe, which were a big Jamaican area. So like growing up, reggae music and like, I guess, I don't want to say black music, but certainly like Afro-Caribbean culture was certainly there. So like really early doors, I used to listen to like Bob Marley and like Shabba Ranks and stuff like that. Supercat, kind of like Jamaican stuff from like 80s, early 90s. Shakademas, that kind of stuff, And then I guess what happened for me with that Britpop happened. And by now I'm getting into my middle teens. And I sort of looked at Noel and Liam and I guess at people in Pulp and thought, oh, hang about, you can be a bit like alternative here. And these people sort of are a bit like me. I felt like an affinity to them in some way. And I guess that's when I started getting into sort of more like guitar, indie music, and sort of maybe harboring ideas about making my own music. There were a bunch of bands at that time in Sheffield, the Long Pigs, obviously Richard Hawley's band, and Pulp, but there were also bands like Baby Bird, Speedy, a band called British Racing Green, and they all played at this festival called Music in the Sun, which looking back, it was tiny. There were only like 2,000 people there, but I remember it being like a real pivotal moment for me when I was like, oh, I could be that. I could, it's that thing of if you see it, you can do it, right? And I guess as a working class lad in Sheffield, seeing that, and particularly Noel and Liam, because I'm one or two brothers and I see how they are with each other. And obviously I've come to know them and be quite pally with Noel over years and supported them and all that stuff. But like watching how they interacted and 1 minute they fighting, next minute they're loving each other, felt very relatable, and also the lyrical content, talk about cigarettes and alcohol at 15. That's like, whoa, amazing. They're great. Both of them are great, aren't they? You know what I mean? So I think like it really turned me on, and it were obviously massive thing, weren't it, culturally? We're getting into like Euro 96 time now. And obviously I'm growing up in Sheffield as well, and it's important to remember like I've grown up in the era of the miners' strike, the Battle of Orgreave, being beaten by the politicised police force, the Hillsborough disaster, the decline. You think of the Full Monty movie. That's the context in which I'm growing up, right? And I sometimes have to explain this to my wife, who's from London, and she's like, Sheffield seems really nice. I'm like, yeah, but you don't realise what it was like in 80s, you know what I mean? You're a real sort of angry place, a lot of sort of functional alcoholism. And then when Britpop happened and Euro 96 and Blair's government got in, it were like, oh my word, like, life could be amazing. This football team had been doing well. It were like, it just seemed like a moment of real positivity and hope. And I guess in some way instilled in the likes of me and the Arctic Monkeys and Milburn and maybe Richard Hawley and a few others, like maybe Pulp, like anything's possible. We can Pulp at headline Glastonbury. I mean, like mental, right? And it just seemed like gave us the idea it was possible. And I think unless you have that in your art, because I think to myself, my mate talks about this a lot. My mate started Tramlines Festival and has gone on to become this like mad entrepreneur. This is a school friend of mine, James O'Hara, and he's like, what is it about us compared to generation before or even after where we thought that were a reasonable thing to do? And I guess it's the social context that it comes around in, you know what I mean? There were just a moment in history, I guess, from about sort of 94 till maybe mid-noughties when it were like, anyone can do, we can do this, why not? And that's kind of gone, I guess, a little bit. There's a lot more limitations on young people now. But yeah, started making music around this time, like coming up to Millennium, started thinking about being in a band myself, and just felt like for a minute there were like no ceiling. Anyone can do anything. It's perfectly reasonable for your mates to have a number one or for me to have a top 10 or do you know what I mean? And mm-hmm. That's not a normal set of circumstances, I don't think, because that's very fleeting and very rare that happens in history,
Can you remember the first song that you wrote that you thought, right, this is a really good song?
I wrote a band called 1984, which I guess people know from the Arctic Monkeys song when it says Dancing Like a Robot from 1984. We had this song called Jangles, and it was like about this lad who I grew up with who we had sort of parallel lives, and then we went like that, right? He became an heroin addict, and he could have been me and I could have been him, given a different set of circumstances. And the song weren't even that good, but there was something in the words and the way I'd sort of expressed the words and stuff where people were like, that's really good. Now we're doing like performance poetry by this point. I've got into I've been working at the Boardwalk in Sheffield music venue, and I got into like Cooper Clarke and stuff like that. And I think that was the first time I liked anybody who weren't like my pal or like my cousin or something had liked anything I'd done. And I thought, oh, yeah, this is kind of cool. And then this guy called Jeff Barradale, who ended up managing me at Monkeys, he was like, you're really good, you, John. He says, maybe you should like just do a thing on your own, you know. So I started going down to this studio with this guy called Alan Smythe, who were very responsible for the Sheffield scene of which I was part of, and started just cutting demos with him. And from there, a lot of the songs that ended up on the State of Things were born. And I guess it's like a confidence thing, innit? You write one, you write two. I had this song Bandits, and what I'd do is I'd just invite a different mate down to play music for me, because my musical skills weren't all that at that point. I used to play a bit, but not that come a bit later, the music. And I was just sort of doing the melodies and the lyrics. And it just sort of snowballed from there. I think like you just get confidence, don't you? And by now, Jeff's got this company which were backing us and Arctic Monkeys, this management firm, and they're like paying for me to do demos and stuff. And it all just started coming together, really. And by this point, there's this sort of scene bubbling where weirdly all music press are coming up from London, and it just sort of went a bit bonkers, really. And they started calling me the godfather of the Sheffield scene. And I'm like, how did they, it's like, you don't realise how it happens, do you? It's almost like by accident or something. But confidence is a great thing for songwriters, when you feel loved and valued and stuff, you feel like you can do anything. You're flying, aren't you?
Absolutely. And now you've just released your 7th album, Heatwave in the Cold North. It's excellent. How does it feel that it's out? And I think it's doing pretty well in the midweeks. Is that correct?
Yeah, we're currently 6 in the charts. We think we're definitely going to hold on for a top 10, all being well. Maybe even a chance of like higher. What is great is that there seems to have been a real resurgence of it. The band's always done all right. Like the first album were obviously very, very successful. And then I became sort of politicised, and I guess went through a series of permutations, writing political records, psychedelic records, hedonistic records. And then I've landed weirdly back in this zone where I guess it's the most sort of straight down the line stuff I've done in a long time. And it just seems to a bit of chord. I mean, all the songs have been on Radio 2 playlist. I've been on telly a bunch of times, and the gigs have been incredibly well attended and selling out and all that stuff, and massive festival appearances. And I just feel very lucky that I'm in my 40s now, and to still be doing it is amazing in and of itself, because a lot of the bands that I came around with, they're gone. Obviously there's Arctic Monkeys, the biggest band in the world, but there's a load of other bands around us and them who are gone. So to be having this moment and about to get my second top 10 record, it's amazing. I feel really blessed. And it's very exciting, I have to say.
Did you go into the recording of this album then with any ideas of how it should sound and the kind of songs you wanted to write about?
Yeah, I did actually. So basically, when lockdown happened, I was obviously really worried about my income, because I've got no, live is the thing where my money comes from. And conversely, although it was terrible for lots of people, it ended up being like really profitable for me. I ended up writing songs for a bunch of pop artists and ended up writing something for an advert. And in course of doing this, I ended up palling up with this lad called Danny. And like I explained earlier, if I'm hanging out with someone at time, there's a good chance I'll write songs with him. I've always been like that, just like, should we write a tune? I've always done that since the very beginning. And me and him just fell upon writing songs together. And he come and I've got a building in my backyard, like a shed. And he come and lived in my shed. And of all the partnerships I've ever had, including like people who were very successful in their own right, something about me and his partnership just clicked straight away. And I think that's because he's very good at melody, maybe not so much at lyrics. I'm maybe better at lyrics than I am at melody. And we would agree upon some music, get some chords together, play a little bit, get a groove we liked. And then the melodic thing would come mainly from him. And I'd do all of the words. And that would therefore enable me to avoid that sort of pitfall that a lot of northern indie, particularly male indie singers from the north get into, where they're doing that same melody they do all the time. You know, the way they finish the sentences off and you're like, oh, you do that on every album you've ever done ever. Who wants to hear that again? And it sort of just became from another place. So the music, I guess we would be tapping into like soul and retro music, but the melodies he would do would come more from like American R&B stuff like Frank Ocean, that kind of stuff. And then I guess because I sing in the Sheffield dialect and in the Sheffield accent, it becomes this like fourth thing. You add them three ingredients and you get this like fourth thing. And it feels very much like something that's like the start of an ongoing thing now, where me and him can really like hunker down and write some really kind of great record. I feel like any minute now we're going to write something like that's perfect. You know, we've not really got to where, although this album's great and everybody's like, it's your best album ever and all that, I just want to do another one now. It's going to give me a taste for it that I'm like, all right, well, let me just push on here and make more, you know, because like going back to what I said earlier, confidence, that's what it is. You feel confident, you're getting on radio, you're getting on tele, fans are, you know, we've sold double albums of this one than we did the last one. And that tells its own story, doesn't it? Do you know what I mean? So I think like it's just about keeping on going. And a lot of people, they made up their minds about the band 16 years ago. So it's about slowly just like, oh yeah, actually you're not what I thought you are. You're this other thing, you know, and it's a career, isn't it? There's that John Lennon quote, life's what happens when you're busy making other plans. And that's seems to be what's happening to me. Like, you know,
love that quote. It's one of my favorite quotes.
Yeah.
So many brilliant songs on the album. Let's talk about some of them. The album kicks off with the title track, Heatwave in the Cold North, which is also the first single. It's a great way to start the album. It has a summery classic soul vibe that immediately lifted me up and it just put a big smile on my face. I love the strings. Strings are great. It's a real toe tapper. I couldn't stop moving to it. It's also your biggest hit so far in over a decade, I think. It was named Radio 2's Record of the Week. So you must have been well pleased with that.
Yeah, mate, love it. I think it's got like that classic thing. People just seem to love it. And I think the trick of it is that even though the song feels retro, the chorus, I'm like double time on the vocal, almost like in the way a rapper would. And the melody's deceptively very modern. It's not an old soul melody. The chorus is, but the pre and the verse, they're like double time, like modern melody. And it sort of it's therefore able to straddle in two worlds, if you know what I mean. And I guess obviously, like I said, because I'm doing it in my Sheffield accent and stuff, it makes it like this unique thing. And people seem to love it, you know, they absolutely love it. And yeah, we were all over at radio last summer. And also, like, I've wrote a lot of political music and I've been very much known in recent years for my association with Jeremy Corbyn. You know, I got him on stage at that football thing, and that's at that football stadium, and that's where the song started, or Jeremy Corbyn and all that. And I guess I don't want to be a political artist. Like, I do write political songs sometimes, but like sometimes I just want to get a bit mashed up and have a nice time with my missus and have a kiss and a cuddle, and that's as valid as an emotion as like down with the government. Do you understand what I mean? And I don't want to be Billy Bragg. That's not what I'm trying to do, you know. And it was nice to just go back to something that's quite a simple sentiment, really. And yeah, it's gone mad. People love it, and I think really set the tone for the record. And we wrote it last summer when it was an heat wave, so it felt like very much befitting the moment, you know.
And also your last single, and it's probably your most personal, A Letter to My 20-Year-Old Self. What was the catalyst that made you sit down and write that song?
I just went in studio one day in my shed with Dan, and he says, what would it be like if you wrote to your 21-year-old self in a tune? And I was like, oh, great concept, man. And as a lyricist, I just went for it. And it's the first song I've ever written where I've cried while I was writing it. Because there's no doubt I've made a bunch of mistakes. I've had a long and varied career, and I've done a load of stupid things, said a load of stupid things. And it's me looking back from a good place, right? Of a place where things are going all right. And saying to myself, look, maybe you shouldn't have done that, maybe you shouldn't have done that. But equally, be kind to yourself. Don't be so hard on yourself. And it just set me off. I started bawling my eyes out. And even sometimes when I'm listening to it or playing it, I feel a bit emotional. And obviously that's struck a chord with people, and like Martin Ware, who I greatly respect, Cabaret Voltaire, Evan 17, Human League. He said, it's your best song you've ever written, John. He said, it sounds like Scott Walker or something, which that's what I look for. I look to them older musicians. I mentioned Richard Hawley earlier, Noel. I look to them people who've been in there and done it even more than me. And if they're telling me it's great, makes me feel really good, that. And to that end, we did a social art exhibition in Sheffield at Fagan's Pub. And we invited members of the public, MPs, celebrities, all that, to write to their 21-year-old self. We had like mental people write, like Corbyn wrote us a letter, Brian Eno wrote us a letter, Sporty Spice, like all these mad people writing, displayed them. That's now going to become a big podcast with me hosting it. So it's even that as a concept and as a thing's like got legs of its own. And I think when you write songs and you release them, they become bigger than you, don't they? It's not my song anymore, that it's everybody else's. It's sort of left me. The best letter we had was from our 5-year-old Reggie, who said, wrote to his future self, he said, "Dear Reggie, keep doing your art, keep playing footy, don't be mardy, and be a good boy. Don't drink too much beer. Love, Reggie, age 5." I mean, there's the winner, right?
Yeah, that's a brilliant idea for a podcast as well. And you also had Stevie Lamack, you had Mel C, Belfast Colin Murray as well. I used to work in McDonald's with Colin Murray.
He's a great lad, Colin. He really is. He's a top man, Colin. I've been on his show a bunch of times, and his letter was great, actually. We had Mark Stewart from the pop group who he died after writing the letter. So it's like almost like in some ways, it's like his last will and testament. It's really, I need to like do a thing about that because I've been so busy with my album, I've not really had a chance to pay a tribute to him. But yeah, amazing, mate. We had there's so many celebrities and MPs and sports people. I would be here all day, Nick, dropping like clanging name drops, But I'd certainly plan to sort of push on with it after the album because I think it's a project that's really valuable because it's instructive in some way to young people, and there are people hopefully who'll take on board some of that advice, I think.
It's definitely a podcast I'll subscribe to, definitely. It's a brilliant idea.
Wicked.
My favourite song on the album is the final track, Living Without You. What can you tell me about
that? So, firstly, we had this brief of what would it sound like if Ian Brown sang Drake songs. And that's what we were, I guess, trying to do. It doesn't sound anything like that, does it, at all? But that was a sort of mission statement. Again, melodically coming from that sort of American R&B, Frank Ocean, Drake kind of world. And I read somewhere, I'm really interested in like the science of songwriting and stuff. And I read this thing somewhere that it said that Nothing Compares to You, that Prince wrote, obviously Sinead O'Connor had a big hit with it, is actually about Prince's attempts to stop smoking. And when you listen to the lyrics, you're like, oh yeah. So like, obviously he's making the girl or the object, the love interest sort of, and the cigarette sound like one and the same thing. So you're not quite sure. And I thought, that's great, because I was also trying to stop smoking at the time, which I failed miserably. So I tried to go for that thing again. And again, the Sheffield dialect. So like, there's a lyric in it, he says, anybody with a weakness would have had a job a Saturday. Now, if you were saying that in sort of standard English, you would say, anybody with a weakness would have had a job on Saturday, on Saturday. But it's in the Sheffield kind of parlance, you'd say, anybody with a weakness would have had a job a Saturday. And it's just them little things that like, that's why I like Bob Marley, because he's got them, even though it's like standardized English at times, there's like patois things that like, you'd only really get if you were Jamaican. And so I like to put them things in because I think it gives a lot of this album's quite soulful, quite introspective, and it gives it a sort of believability. And that's a lot of modern pop music. They're using very sort of standardized words that I like. It feels a bit generic and doesn't feel like the singer is invested in it. And I feel like when I put those things in, you're like, oh yeah, this is actually someone's thoughts and emotions, and it's a real person. It's not sort of just some generic thing, you know what I mean? And I think that's why people gravitate towards it. But I love that tune. That's probably one of my favourites on album, actually.
I love the album sleeve. It's genius. Did the camel behave itself for the photo shoot? And what was his name?
The camel was called Coco. He's a Brummie camel. He's from Midlands. I mean, camels can be a bit testy, can't they, as a rule? But he was a lovely camel, really sweet. He's called Coco. He's owned by the oldest circus company in the country. He's very well cared for. He's an ethical camel. And yeah, I mean, obviously me and the factory, the Cold North and the label were like, you know, you need something to denote the Heatwave. And there's a lovely lady at the record label called Roma, and she was like, what you need, John, is a camel. And I was actually with him when we found out the Queen had passed away, which, you know, like there's obviously pivotal moments in history, like where were you when Twin Towers went down, or Diana died, or Elvis died, or whatever. And I'll never, obviously, Queen dying, like, whether you're of a Republican persuasion or not, and I very much am, but if you, whatever your political persuasion, it's just the fact that, like, this key moment in history, and I was walking down some road trying to dodge traffic holding a camel, I thought, this is great, you know, I love it.
I'm sure it stopped the traffic.
Yeah, everyone were getting out of the car and like having the photo took with it and stuff. And there's even like a bus company have done a tribute to me on local bus, double-decker bus, put all artwork all over so that everywhere people keep messaging me like, just been on a bus with you and a camel on the side, which is just amazing, isn't it? Like, who wouldn't want that, you know?
And you recently travelled from Sheffield to Africa, meeting musicians in various countries along the way. What inspired that idea?
Well, I kind of feel like music's one of the few things that connect humanity. I mean, you talked about Belfast before, and I love that story that David Holmes tells about. There were a club, and I forget the name of it, and they were saying a lot of the energy for the peace process had come about because a lot of young lads who were involved in the conflict on either side were going and taking pills together, right, and having that sort of euphoric oneness and togetherness, and it sort of made a lot of fighting seem a bit, how can you fight after you've been hugging each other on it? You know what I mean? And I love that music's a way of connecting people, you know, with the exception of maybe really hardcore Wahhabi Muslims. There's probably no culture in the world where music's forbidden or not practiced, right? And that's very rare. There's only maybe food and sex that are the only other things that occupy that space that everybody does. And originally I'd planned to go to our twin city of Chengdu in China, but then obviously Xi's draconian COVID policies and Putin's war with Ukraine made traveling east to Chengdu nigh on impossible. And with about a month to go, we were like, where are we going to go instead? So we decided to go to another twin city of ours, which is Kitwe in Zambia. Now, in the 70s, there was an amazing psych rock scene there called Zamrock, and sort of African-fronted psychedelic rock. I mean, what's not to love? And a lot of these musicians, they died in the HIV epidemic of the 80s because obviously they were musicians and they were living a wild life. A lot of them got HIV and died. So my idea was to travel from Sheffield to Kitwe, which is a big mining industrial place similar to Sheffield, right? To travel there overland and just see all the music in between. And there was so much stuff we saw. And so when this album campaign sort of levels out a bit after this week and gets in chart and whatever, I'm going to start turning my attention to putting up that footage, sharing it, because some of the things I've seen are just to talk about and wouldn't do them justice. I mean, I went to a festival in Uganda on the banks of the River Nile where there's like crocodiles coming in, and it's like low key a bit of a queer festival because obviously they've got really kind of awful homophobic laws in Uganda. So there's a bit of that, and then you know, we went to across the plains up to Kilimanjaro, saw the animals, saw like street musicians in Nairobi who were using the battery from a motorbike to power a DJ rig made out of plastic, like stayed with the Zawosi family in Bagamoyo in Tanzania. They're like a legendary musical family there. Went to Zanzibar, learned about Tarab music, which is a fusion of Arabic and African rhythms and Arabic melodies. Just like, there's so much. Obviously Morocco, and then that's before I've even mentioned the whole of Europe, right? So yeah, it's mental. We've filmed so much stuff, and hopefully I can start sharing some of that stuff, because like, I think there's a misconception in the West that African music all sounds like Gracelands or something. And the reality is that a lot of the genres they've got over there, they're electronic music genres that we have no knowledge of whatsoever. They sound completely different to anything we've heard. And so being able to share that, and I guess be a pupil, you know what I mean? Just learn. I'm not going over there to discover. It's not a colonial thing. I'm going over there to sit, be humble, close my mouth, open my ears and listen, you know, and to watch. And I feel very excited to share that with people soon.
Good. I look forward to seeing that. Sounds amazing.
Yeah, it were, mate. I would say, I don't want to say sort of, you know, trip of a lifetime, but definitely that.
And you've just announced an acoustic tour in June through to July. How much are you looking forward to that, and what can we expect? Will it just be an acoustic guitar?
Me and our guitarist, Ed. Obviously, we played a big shows with a band, and that last tour we did were phenomenal. But I sometimes like to I do it every few years. I'll just go in small venues, acoustic, me talking about the songs, having a bit of fun, and just reduce it to I just like to do it sometimes. It's just a different medium, because obviously at big shows, everyone just wants to go balmy, jump around, go crazy from off, which is wonderful, and I love it. And same with festivals, but it's nice to just perform in a different setting. So otherwise it becomes very boring very quickly being a musician. Do you know what I mean? So doing that, I've got 4 unsigned artists on every night, because my thing now is to try and, you know, I've been lucky enough to support a lot of my friends in the music industry who are massive. And I want to sort of pass that baton back and do something when I'm helping unsigned artists, because it's a really fertile scene at the minute. There's loads of great artists at the minute. So I'm looking forward to doing that. And then hopefully going to get back over Belfast, Dublin, bits of Europe if I can, maybe even a bit of America, and just keep busy, man. You know, just got to keep the wheels turning.
Each of your 6 previous albums has reached the top 20 in UK charts, and obviously it looks like the new one is about to go into the top 10. Apart from the new album, if you were to recommend one of the Reverend and the Makers albums to someone who had never heard the band before, what album would you tell them to start with?
Oh, what a question. Maybe the first one. Go the first one. If not, the fans love the second one. The second one's the worst charting, but the sort of deepest, you know, politics, personal stuff. But yeah, if you're a sort of cold listener, go to the first one, because it's the sort of foundation stone of the band and the thing that got the band into a degree of popularity in first place. I don't think it's the best album, but it's certainly the place you would start, I reckon.
If I wanted to make a playlist of the best Reverend and the Makers songs, what are the 5 songs I should have on that playlist?
Heatwave in the Cold North, Heavyweight Champion of the World, A Letter to My 21-Year-Old Self, Silence is Talking, and Baseline.
Happy days. That'll do. That'll be on the list. Jon, looking back on the last 2 decades of Reverend and the Makers, what's been your highlights so far?
My highlights, having 40,000 people in my home city, in the park, all with their hands in the air to my music, because I grew up a mile away. And to have that, after being written off so many times by the music press and whoever else, and to have that years later, you know, I went to war with Enemy at one bit, because were just arses. And I said, my manager went to me, Jon, your band will exist when the Enemy is no longer printed. And so it's proved. And I don't know, I feel like in the fullness of time, I'm winning. Not winning, that sounds like it's a competition, but I'm getting recognised for what I do more and more and more as time goes on, you know. And I feel like, in many ways, like, you know, that's what it's about. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. You know what I mean? It's definitely kind of about a body of work, about a career. It's not about sort of trying to be number one or trying to be the biggest or the best or any of that. It's about the sort of love you have for people, that people have for you in their art. So obviously I go outside with my acoustic guitar after every gig. I take out crowd. I'm always playing gigs in my fans' houses. And I feel like the people who do understand the band and love the band, they love it so deeply and passionately that it's a real special thing, you know. And I feel like if I got run over by a bus tomorrow, I've left something good on this earth. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Just a couple more, John. For us music fans, music is the soundtrack to your memories. What song or album, when you listen to it, brings back the best memories for you?
There's an album called 2 Sevens Clash by Culture, which is the record that Don Letts used to play to the punks to get them into reggae music. And I don't know why, but I always think of that. Just driving out on a sunny day with me missus, just playing that really loud. That'd be like my ideal thing to do. If I could pick something to do today, it'd be Red Hot and we'd drive in Peak District and we'd have that on and life would be wonderful.
What song or album is your guilty pleasure?
Labour of Love 2 by UB40, because obviously they made a bunch of credible albums at the start of their career, heavily politicised, you know, a lot of different sort of ethnicities in the band come off the dole and all that, and they never really got the plaudits that the specials got, even though the music was as good. And then obviously they started doing all them cover versions, and I guess for many people are considered to be cheesy, but it's the only music that where white, black and Asian people all can unite and come out, and it's just, as a kid, it was a thing that united all communities. And I remember my mum and dad playing it to death in car on a cassette, and it just reminds me of good times. And yeah, they're all cover versions, but they also made a lot of like old Jamaican musicians into overnight millionaires with that record.
Yeah.
And it just makes me smile when I hear it. It just makes me feel great. I love it.
So, John, that's me done. Is there anything else you would like to mention before we wrap up? Anything else coming up?
No, just buy the album, come and see us on acoustic tour, and keep listening to XS Noize.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for it. That'll do me.
Yeah, good man. Cheers, Mark.
Yes, take it easy, John.
Take care, buddy. Thanks, pal.
Good luck with the album. Bye-bye. Bye.